Hi. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Welcome, everyone, to our celebration for Professor Steve Dean's newest book, just out from Oxford University Press, Racial Capitalism and International Tax Law, the Story of Global Jim Crow. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Professor Jessica Silby, and I'm the Academic Dean for Intellectual Life, which means that I get to host events like this with the goal of enriching our learning and discussions about law together. So it is my pleasure to welcome you to this event. For those of you who don't know, this is not Steve's first book. He is the author of many books, and I encourage you to peruse his other titles when you have time. He's a prolific author and celebrated teacher here at BU Law, and one of the many reasons that our tax program at BU is so widely known and celebrated. Come on in, don't be shy. Yep. He is the Paul Siskin Research Scholar here at BU Law, and his scholarship, of which this book is a prime example, explores international tax policy, racial equity, and the intersection of tax law with philanthropy and social enterprise. He has many scholarly contributions. His many scholarly contributions has made him a leading voice in the movement to bring racial equity into tax scholarship and policy making. His work has influenced debates from the halls of Congress to the United Nations, and he's a regular and influential advisor to organizations such as the Tax Justice Network and the OECD, which is the Organization for the Economic Cooperation and Development, which is an international organization that works with over 100 countries across the world. I'm not going to spend hardly any time up here talking about the book, because that's what our distinguished panelists are for, but I would like to, and I'm going to introduce them to you in a moment, but I want to say two things about Steve's new book, which I hope will pique your interest, even if tax is not your prime obsession like it is with Steve. First, it is a book about international tax, that is sure, and its effect on African decolonization. But the book begins with a quote from Maya Angelou, a US author, poet, and civil rights activist. And so you might wonder why? Why? You have to read the book, or maybe we'll hear about it today. Second, this book does inform readers about treaties and statutes and tax subsidies and explains the roots of our frustration with the global tax system that really does fail to fund the public services that the whole world needs and expects. But it is also, and I think one of the great gifts of this book, is that it is also full of compelling stories, stories of civil rights leaders, of policymakers and presidents who influenced and sometimes talked back to global tax policy that we have today, which is plagued, as this book demonstrates, with anti-Black racism that benefits billionaires at the expense of billions of people. So it is a story about law and a story about stories. So to speak about this remarkable book, we have three distinguished guests, and I'm really quite honored that they are here with us today. To my right, first is from the University of Nairobi, Professor Attiya Waris. Professor Waris has many specialties, including debt law, illicit financial flows, and corporate tax reform. In 2021, she became the UN Independent Expert on Foreign Debt and Human Rights. She is both a scholar and a lawyer, having practiced in front of the High Court of Kenya, for example, as well as the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, among many other places. Welcome to BU Law, Professor Waris. Now, from BU's Pardee School of Global Studies, we welcome Dean Scott Taylor, who is the Dean of Pardee and a Professor of International Relations. Dean Taylor's research and teaching are in the areas of African politics and political economy, with a particular emphasis on political and economic reform. He is the author of many books as well, including Globalization and Cultures of Business in Africa, From Patrimonialism to Profit, and also The Politics of Southern Africa, Transition and Transformation. Like Professor Waris, Dean Taylor has put his scholarship to practice. He is a consultant for USAID, for the African Development Bank, and the World Bank. He has served also as an election observer in a number of African countries, including Ghana, Liberia, Kenya, Mozambique, Nigeria, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. Welcome to BU Law, Dean Taylor. In the middle, we have Professor Koritha Mitchell, Professor of English at the BU College of Arts and Sciences. She is an expert in African American literature and culture, and her scholarship, such as the award-winning book Living with Lynching, African American Lynching Plays, Performance, and Citizenship from 1890 to 1930, examines how texts, both written and performed, have helped terrorized communities survive and thrive. Her most recent book, From Slave Cabins to the White House, Homemade Citizenship in African American Culture, which was published in 2020, was named a Best Book of the Year by Ms. Magazine and Black Perspectives, and it became a Choice Outstanding Academic title in 2021. Like Professors Waris and Dean Taylor, Professor Mitchell's scholarship has had public impact. Her work has been discussed widely in influential media such as Time Magazine, The Washington Post, CNN, Good Morning America, NPR, and in October 2023, she received the Progressive Women's Voices Impact Award from Women's Media Center. Welcome to the law school, Professor Mitchell. So I could go on about these distinguished guests, but we're here to hear from them and about Steve's book. Now, Steve wants to start off the conversation, and because it's his celebration, we're going to defer to him. And then each of our guests will have the opportunity to share their thoughts and wisdom. We expect we'll have time, about 15, 20 minutes for questions at the end, and I really encourage it. It should be a good conversation. Thank you for being here.
Well, I'd certainly like to echo Dean Silby's thanks to the three incredible folks here on at the table with me. It's just a real honor to have three such important folks here to talk about this book. And I want to thank a lot of people. Dean Silby is one of them. Dean Nwachi-Willig, who has been stolen by the provost, unfortunately couldn't be here, but she's got to go do that. It's important. But there are a lot of people who aren't in the room who I also want to thank. And those of you who had a chance to take a look at the introduction will know that one of them is my mom, who could not be with here today, but I know is looking down on us. And I mean that literally because she's flying from Toronto to Nassau today. She's just so busy that she couldn't be here today, but she, you know, it's great. She's awesome. She's an incredible woman. And so one of the places she will often visit is where one of my sisters lives. I have three big sisters. One of them lives in Portland, Oregon. And one of the things, my son is about the same age as her two kids, so they have a great time together. And one of the things they love doing during the summers there is going to the great public pools in Oregon, in Portland. They have spectacular public pools, and I couldn't figure it out because, you know, there are no public pools in the rest of the country, and, you know, there's a story as to why we don't have them. And the story is basically this. When integration happened, when a lot of cities and towns were told, well, you got this lovely pool, now you can share that pool with everybody. A lot of cities and towns said, we'll just fill it in with dirt. We'll just have no pools. We'd rather have no pool than share it with people who are a different color than us. But of course, Portland, this is my own personal theory, please feel free to let me know if I got this wrong, there were just no black people there. So they were like, sure, we'll do that. There just aren't any people here. So the upside is that there's some great pools there. So if you're ever in Portland, enjoy the slides and all the other great features of their pools. But I tell that story, and it's an important story that Heather McGee recounts in her book, Some of Us, helping explain why we can't have nice things, and that racism is often one of the reasons that we don't have nice things. Actually, I'll just show you. There's one slide.
The slide's right up.
Oh, it is. Oh,
Look.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So, almost like a plan. So you can't read any of this really, but what this is corporate tax revenues starting from around when the story that I'm telling starts, right? So it almost seems like we decided as a country, and this is of course when the US is playing a leading role in the world, that we kind of didn't want to tax multinationals anymore. And the story they tell in the book is the story of why, right? Why we decided not to have nice things anymore, why we decided to basically sabotage our global tax system around the time when Africa was decolonizing. I won't go into all the details, but that's essentially the story they tell in the book, a racial panic that Professor Vanessa Ogle, a historian at Yale, talks about in this context of decolonization. We essentially decided that we were just not going to tax multinationals anymore, which is really quite shocking. It's less shocking that we would sabotage system for others, but that it was worth it for us to do it for ourselves as well is really quite telling. So I'm not going to say much more. I'm going to read a little bit Somebody suggested that I do read a few paragraphs, and I think that was a great idea, so I will do that. So this is from the conclusion, and this is, I'm going to talk, the conclusion starts by talking about three different books. One is The Black Tax by Andrew Carl, talking about the way state and local tax systems in the US were sort of weaponized against, not sort of, were directly weaponized against Black Americans during Jim Crow. The second is Ira Katznelson's book, When Affirmative Action Was White, and he talks about essentially the sabotaging of affirmative action and pro-middle class policies after integration. And the third is Why Nations Fail, written by some Nobel Prize winning economists, talking about the way that institutions can be sabotaged in order to achieve less than savory ends. All right, so I'll just read. In his book, The Black Tax, Andrew Carl tells a story about power. He recounts techniques used to weaponize state and local taxes against Black Americans in the century following the Civil War. Most importantly, he explains how, quote, Black disenfranchisement gave local administrators free rein to treat Black people less as constituents to serve and more as subjects to exploit and punish, end quote. I say the creation of the OECD, and to be fair, I worked for them once and not on tax. They would never hire me on tax. The creation of the OECD replicated that feat at the global level, and nobody noticed. Katznelson begins the conclusion of his book, When Affirmative Action Was White, with a hypothetical. He invites readers to imagine two countries, one the richest in the world, the other amongst its most destitute. Then suppose that a global program of foreign aid transferred well over $100 billion, but to the rich nation, not the poor. This is exactly what happened in the United States as a result of the cumulative impact of the most important domestic policies of the 1930s and 1940s. End quote. His illustration, meant to capture the impact of the exclusion of Black Americans from the New Deal in Jim Crow America, offers an eerie echo of an early skeptic of the double tax treaties that the OECD helped introduce, who compared those to unrestricted grants and aid from developing countries to developed ones. Finally, Akemoglu and Robinson's central insight in Why Nations Fail hinges on the power of pivotal institutional developments during critical junctures, end quote, to shape states' fates. Glad I said that right. Global Jim Crow tells just such a story of disenfranchisement and reverse foreign aid, denying scores of newly sovereign countries the opportunity to flourish. Such stories can be, but are not always, stories of racial capitalism. So the book does talk a lot about tax, and I know a lot of you are afraid of tax, but I would say that's in fact a big part of the scam. You've been told that you should not worry about tax. Smart people in suits will take care of it for you, and everything will be fine. I say everything is not fine. And the more you know about tax, the better. So I'm going to stop there. Excited to have a conversation with the team here.
Great. Me too. All right, we will start with you, Professor Waris. Go for it.
I love that kind of introduction. I'm going to go for it.
And bring the microphone super close.
Yes.
Like,
yes.
So people hear you.
Thank you. Can you hear me at the back? Yes? Are we good? Okay. I tend to be a bit soft-spoken, so bear with me.
even closer.
Even,
Like just pretend you're, you know, like Taylor Swift. I don't know.
Oh, okay.
What would be the appropriate?
Okay, Steve.
There we go. Yes, perfect. There we go. There we go. There we go.
Let's hope people will pay millions to come and see me now.
Yeah, there we go.
All right. I think for me, the book has been a fascinating journey of a friendship that started during COVID, when we were debating racism and structural discrimination in the tax system. And my answer was, there is no racism, but there is structural discrimination, because the lawyer in me kept saying, I have to be able to prove the racism. Someone can take us to court for saying racism. So it came from that sort of Commonwealth legal background. But if I take you through a walk through Kenya, and I'll tell you that at independence, we had something called the African Socialism Policy, which was like an affirmative action policy that was put in place in the 1960s. And then, you know, thinking about where that little chart is taking us. And what they said was, incidentally, it was crafted by Obama's father. A little bit strange, but here we go. What they argued was that we've just come out of independence. We've only developed certain parts of the country. So you're going to continue to pay taxes, but you're also going to continue to pay what we call black tax, which I think you use the same term here sometimes, which is continue to pay for your cousin's education, your granddad's healthcare bills. All of that continues in place, and then we are going to have a country in place. And the reality on the ground for most Africans and most Kenyans was that there wasn't a system in place, and the system did not get developed, and there was no income tax coming into those spaces. And so fast forward into COVID, and Steve and I are having this conversation about racism and structural discrimination, and I'm like, no, it's in the system. It isn't deliberate. This is something that's just historical. And he made me really think twice, and I think I may be coming on to his side a little bit. I will never give in. Okay, so how does that start to roll out in my life? And I take you to his conclusion, because he talks about complexity and common sense. And I think for me, that was the balance. Saying that in that sentence was really useful, because we have a very famous Commonwealth judge called Lord Denning, for whoever knows about him, and he argues that common sense is rarely common, which he's absolutely right about. But how do you now deal with this tax system that's getting more complicated? And in these layers of racism, one of the first things I started to see was, for example, there were cheaper tax havens and then more expensive tax havens. And people of color who were now coming up in the world were using the cheaper tax havens like Mauritius and Seychelles. And then the others were using the more expensive ones like Switzerland. And so you start to see this layering of who goes where, why they go there. And of course, it's layered with their wealth levels. And this, for me, is what was showing itself really in the book. And so who uses the system became very interesting for me while I was reading through Steve's book. But I come from a background of social services. And I always try to remind people that we don't need a tax system if you don't need it to be spent on something. So we shouldn't be collecting taxes without a game plan on what you're going to use it for, which takes me to these wonderful stories about his mom and the healthcare system and the education system. And I'm thinking, well, these are extremely important connections, because it doesn't matter if we're talking about a global financial system, a domestic one, one down at state level rather than federal. At the end of the day, the state should only extract for a particular purpose or a particular need. And what also brought layer into it for me was reference to like the Ku Klux Klan. And this is a little weird, but earlier this year, I discovered that my family were indentured labor in East Africa. That's how they came in, and it was only indentured because slavery had been banned globally. And so that's what they shifted into. And we couldn't find documents or paperwork on it. And then I realized for 40 years, there was no conversation about what my family had been doing in the East African coast, and it's because of shame. And I think there's elements of shame in this system on taxation that we're also not dealing with and not talking about. And so it's also the human conversation in this book that I really appreciated. So thank you, and I cede the floor.
So I'll stay seated since that's how you do in the law school, apparently. So I just want to say that, first of all, thank you for including me in this conversation. I'm really honored to join this conversation. And I guess where I'll start is to say that I come to this very much as an interdisciplinary scholar, and that means a lot of different things. But one of the things it means is that I acknowledge my debt to legal scholars because of critical race theory being something that helped to shape my formation as someone who studies African American literature. And without question, critical race theory makes my very being in the academy possible. So in that way, I'm very much indebted to legal scholars and excited to join this esteemed panel for that reason. I come to this book because I'm a literature scholar. Part of what that means is that I care about texts and I care about stories. So as Dean Silby said, this in some ways is a story about stories, the way that Professor Dean has written this, beginning with stories about his family and interlacing different stories throughout. So part of what's important to me is if we take seriously stories, as I do as a literature scholar, what I want you to understand from my standpoint is that for me, studying literature is not just about literature, but it's also about studying discourses and practices, words and deeds, right? What is most commonly said and done? If you pay attention to what is most commonly said and done, then you will be able to tell the culture of a space, whether it is a classroom space, a city, a nation, whatever is most commonly said and done will tell you the culture of that space. In addition, if you pay attention to stories, then you will know how human beings are making the meaning of their lives. So to my mind, part of what is so important about what Professor Dean has given us is a way to actually tell the story more authentically in ways that we're encouraged not to. So in other words, what is most commonly said and done in any situation is always what's going to be what keeps those who are already in dominant positions, keeps them in a position where the standard of their conduct is actually quite low, right? We don't question, if they're already dominant, then we don't actually question them. And that's a lot of what what Professor Dean has traced in here, is that the question is, okay, are these countries of color gangsters, not whether the people who are already dominant are they gangsters, right? So I just want us to notice like how our normal ways of thinking and talking through things make some things off limits and invisible. And making it visible is so much the work of this book, to make that connection between what's happening on the world stage and what happened in Jim Crow very deliberately is the kind of language we need, because part of what I need you to understand is that when we as scholars don't understand that telling stories is what makes the meaning of our lives, then we get into professions that train us not to tell the story and make things explicit, which is exactly what you just illustrated. I love that, because that training of not being able to label the gangsters who are dominant and only to have the people who are less dominant defend and prove they're not gangsters. That is what is most commonly said and done, and I need us to understand it in those terms. So when it comes to more kind of like the book itself, one of the things that I was struck by, and sort of on that same theme of, what we're discouraged from saying, I was really struck by one of the moments when Professor Dean talks about his family and the dream that they had and how that dream may not have come true. I'm just going to read a little bit from 60. As King related in his speech, he had 4 little children, just like my parents, and they, like King, may have dreamed that we would one day live in a nation where we would not be judged by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character. And I bring that up because, just to give you a concrete example of what I mean about the stories we tell and don't tell. What I would love to see in my lifetime is for people who are considered white to be judged based on the content of their character. That never happens. What happens is whiteness makes you innocent. Whiteness makes you right. And therefore, the stories we tell and our ability to recognize what is most commonly said and done is actually flattened, because we're always looking for the people of color to prove something. We're never looking for there to actually be a standard reached for someone who's considered white to be considered good and decent. Good and decent is assumed, And even if there's criminal behavior, have you noticed how the label criminal doesn't cling if someone's considered white? I need us to recognize that. And so, again, for me, to have stories like this framing how we look at international tax law and to look at the level of license that happens for those who are already in dominant positions, to my mind, we start to tell better stories if we recognize, okay, can we actually have a standard for those who are already dominant? I don't know, maybe a standard of decency even? Like, notice how the way we talk about these things, where there's always a proving ground for the people who are already subordinated. They prove, no one else has to prove. That is a trap that I want us to recognize, and especially for legal scholars to recognize, because you all are on the front lines and can change the way that things are most commonly discussed. So that's the reason I'm approaching it in that way. I also want to highlight the importance of the way that Professor Dean's book really takes the lessons of Reconstruction. My first book, Living with Lynching, is very much in this, Jim Crow reality. And so I'm very aware of something that this book illustrates on the tax scene, which is that the success of marginalized groups is actually what inspires attacks. So part of what you say is that there are only 4 nations, African nations, who are kind of coming to the fore at the moment that all of that starts to happen. I need us to recognize that as a victory. There are victories that are happening for African nations, and the smallest victory leads to this incredible backlash that you trace. If we get into the habit of noticing that if you're in a marginalized group, whether that is on an individual level or a more structural level, as you show, if it's a marginalized group, they don't have to do something wrong to be attacked. That's what I need us to take as a lesson from this story. Simply the success of those 4 nations and then the continuing success is enough to create this violent backlash that has, as you say, made these nations more like subjects to be punished. So taking those lessons from Reconstruction, to my mind, is really, really important. And I'm coming to the end of my time, so the other thing that I just want to bring up, I was struck on 113 by the way that Professor Dean has to share with us the lessons from scholars who are actually bold enough to debunk racist explanations for the failure of nations to thrive. They explain that living in warm climates does not make people too lazy to prosper. They insist that belief in the supernatural does not offer a reliable indication that a nation will languish, and so on. And that, for me, was one of the many moments in the book where, again, Professor Dean is showing us how to be explicit as you challenge. You can't just leave it unsaid, because the truth is, when things are most commonly said and done like these assumptions, right, they're so assumed that sometimes you don't even have to say it out loud, but these beliefs are structuring so much. And so if we get to the point where we recognize that, then we understand that if we're going to push for something like decency, push for something like justice, we have to make explicit those kinds of assumptions and those kinds of common sense, because that is the trick of what is most commonly said and done, is that it begins to feel like common sense. So to my mind, part of what this book does is just give us some language and gives us some strategies for speaking deliberately and changing what is most commonly said and done. Thank you.
Thank you. Dean Taylor.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Jessica and Steve, for allowing me to get out of my end of Bay State Road and come down here to the law school. It's a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. So, for those of you who haven't read Steve's book yet, it basically, 1960 is basically the pivotal year. And that's the year that was known as the Year of Africa, and the year in which a significant number of African countries gained their independence. All of the Francophone countries, Nigeria, all the Francophone countries except Guinea, Nigeria, and that was sort of the wave of African independence. And at that time, the same year as the founding of the OECD, as Steve details quite nicely in the book, established a global tax regime that prevented newly independent African countries from taxing multinationals. So, and he calls this, in his conclusion from which he read a few minutes ago, in the conclusion of the book, the title of the conclusion is "A Fear of a Black Planet," which I got to give you props for being able to drop Public Enemy, a Public Enemy album title into an Oxford University Press book. So kudos for that. But basically frames this as kind of a fear of a black planet. So I am not a tax person. I'm not a lawyer. So I was trying to figure out where I can comment and come in on this book. And I thought about it in terms of the structure and agency debates about the causes of Africa's current sort of malaise, if you will. So, I don't know anything about tax law, but I know a bit, even though I'm a political scientist, I know a bit about African history and the colonial era. I've taught about it for 30 years, written on it, and have spent a number of years in multiple countries. So I was thinking about 1960 and this pivotal moment that Steve describes in the book, and adding a little color to what that is. Now, if we look at Africa today, people look at Africa, and the president has described the countries in Africa in a way that I don't share that opinion. But some of the statistics are dire. 40 to 50% live in extreme poverty. 33% of the world's least developed countries, 33 of the 46 least developed countries in the world are in Africa. Around 300 million people are undernourished. 1.6 million children suffer from HIV. 1 in 10 children will die before the age of 5. These are dire development statistics, right, with which many of us are familiar. But why is this the case, right? The story, often when we're teaching and researching about Africa, people like to either pursue a more structuralist perspective or an agent-based perspective. Say Africans just can't get their act together is the extreme agency argument. The structural argument, which is more in the line of Steve's book, and one that I'm sympathetic to, really, I think captures some of the massive constraints that African countries were under at that time of 1960, at the time of independence. So the effects of global Jim Crow, right, and the post-colonial inheritance. So let me just say a little bit about the post-colonial inheritance and how I think that those structural constraints persist through Steve's argument, through the last 60 years of African independence, and help to explain some of those dire statistics. So if you look at Africa at independence, the economies were structured entirely around primary commodity export, undiversified raw materials going principally to the metropolitan countries. And that persists, right? So you have 90%, Nigeria is still dependent 90% of its exports on oil. Zambia is still dependent 90% of its exports on copper, and it's undifferentiated, no value addition. So at the time of independence, the multinationals dominated the African private sector. Why? Because Africans were forbidden from engaging in private sector activities beyond a few service sectors. So there was actual legal constraints to Africans gaining private sector advantage in proto-capitalist economies. So they were constrained from doing so by law and by force of colonial power. There was scant tax base, local tax base. Attiya alluded to this. Without a private sector and without, with the high levels of informality, there's no place from which to gain local taxes from local companies or certainly from income. Only things like hut taxes, which were one of the causes of the African independence movements in the first place. So the colonial powers set up multinationals in most of their colonies, European and American. So by 1960, you had international mining companies, the Anglo-American, the UK company, American Metal Climax, an American company, oil companies like Total in France, Barclays Bank in finance, and others in manufacturing, machinery, commercial, agricultural sectors, all in foreign hands. So tax would have been one way, a global tax regime that allowed African countries and independents to tax these multinational corporations in their midst would have yielded, as Steve points out, considerable benefits to those economies at a time when they were desperate for that kind of revenue flow, which was necessary to support development. And the whole cause of independence, after all, was to try to provide opportunities for African citizens in their own countries to advance themselves, right? These were denied to them by force of law and colonial legacies. So that is very much reinforcing, I think, the structural argument. I think it's also important to point out that at the time of independence, we also, folks who know a bit about African history and sort of African socialism and at the time, this sort of the Cold War tension between socialism, global socialism, communism, and the Western, American capitalist, presumably democratic model, this tension existed. But at the time of independence, it's important to point out that African leaders, whether they were sort of quasi-African socialist or whether they were capitalist in orientation, were deeply interested in getting support of the West. Leaders like Agostinho Neto in the first anti-colonial leader in Angola, educated in the United States, approached the US government for support. Even Patrice Lumumba in Congo approached the US government for support. It goes, Kwame Nkrumah sought and why? Because they saw in the United States and the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations that would support self-determination, independence, nationalism. Instead, they were rebuffed. So that's a large part of the explanation for these leaders who then went to the other side and pursued policies that were deemed as anti-American by the American leadership at the time. They were rejected by the Dulles brothers, by the Eisenhower administration, even by the Kennedy administration. So to try to seek to get some rapprochement with an American support was completely denied to them. So, and it's worse than just the tax regime, right? So I encourage you to, if you haven't read about this period, about the United States' role in kind of suppressing these ostensible or aspirational allies of the US, rather. Peter Schrader's book on US foreign policy towards Africa remains one of the best texts on this period. You've got Larry Devlin, the former CIA chief in Congo, wrote Chief of Station about the CIA's role in undermining Lumumba. Raoul Peck, the filmmaker, did an excellent documentary film, not the drama film, on Lumumba that's also worth seeing. So all of this stuff, I think, illustrates these tensions at the time. And so while some might question Steve's use of racism as a causal mechanism, and I noticed that Attiya did, behind the scenes, if you read Schrader, you look at Peck, you look at Stephen Kinzer's book on the Dulles brothers, you see that in fact racism was a very strong motivator for the anti-African policies at the time, not just in the realm of tax, but much more broadly. So the inherited tax regime that barred African countries from seeking revenue from multinational companies, which is the subject of Steve's book, contributed later directly to the nationalization of many multinational corporations in the African continent, right? Countries were compelled to nationalize, to try to seize control of their economies. Imagine had they been able to tax these firms at a fair level and benefit from the revenues, arguably that might not have been necessary, right? So all of which, continue to spirals that I won't elaborate on any further because I'm out of time. But like the debt regime, the economic crisis that unfolded over the beginning in the early 1970s and lasted until the mid-1990s in Africa, until you start to see an economic rebound. all of this lays at the feet of some of these policies that were set up in the early 1960s and significantly in terms of the colonial inheritance. And so this is something, you know, again, to kind of like look at this whole structural picture, sort of like what we're dealing with. What I really appreciate about Steve's book is that, so I'm totally unfamiliar with the kind of tax story, but it fits in this larger narrative of the structural constraints under which Africa found itself in as early as 1960, at the era of independence, and that continue to this day in many respects with the inheritance. It's very hard to get out from behind that particular 8-ball. And so what I appreciate is this is new information for me in thinking about, okay, how does the global tax regime play into this? But it fits. And again, if there's a question about, well, this is reductionist to reduce it to sort of racism and an argument about racism, again, read some of those books that I mentioned. They'll highlight for you very clearly and deliberately, looking at cables and everything else about racism's ugly head rearing in terms of the political decision-making on this side of the ocean at that time. So thank you, Steve, for writing the written book.
Steve, do you want to say some things in response?
I'll just say
yeah.
one or two things. Some of you have heard the story before, and I apologize for boring you with it again. So this is totally not the book that I plan to write, right? It is not at all the book that I plan to write. In fact, when I sent the manuscript into Oxford last summer, they said, Steve, you didn't mention race at all in your proposal. And I said, that's true, because I did not think that was the story I was telling. I thought I was going to tell, and I love the way Dr. Mitchell talked about stories, because I think that is really, the book is a book about stories, about the way Reconstruction story was told and mistold and corrected, and the power of stories. They're just so powerful. And what I thought I was going to do in the book was tell, we're in a law building, so I thought I was basically writing a concurrence, right? Not the, the majority opinion was out there, and I was just going to offer a concurrence that would offer a slightly different take on it. And as I started writing and researching, learned a little bit about what Dean Taylor is talking about and what was really happening in the world at this time. And I, saw some of those charts, and there are even more alarming charts that I won't show you. That this wasn't the story we were being told. And so I ended up writing a really powerful dissent, I think, a really angry dissent, which is not at all what I thought I was going to be doing in this book. And it's really important to offer that perspective. I think it's not necessarily true that everything will change, although there are some green shoots in this space. The work that Attiya is doing at the UN is involved in this deeply. There is a movement to create a UN tax framework, which would be a nice break from what's been happening for the last few decades. And not a perfect solution, but at least it's a really inclusive approach to things that I think is really important. So I think there's something very important about writing that dissent, right? Even if it's not going to be the law, you really tell the story in a way that preserves the story, so that people down the road can tell it. I know, so Dr. Taylor's, an expert in so much of this, and I can understand why the tax part of the story wouldn't be one he was told, because it's just not one that has been told, because it really was one that was suppressed, as Dr. Mitchell suggests, is so easy to do, right? And you sort of, it's just so it's so accepted that if things aren't going right. So she referred to gangsters. The one last story that I'll tell. So I grew up in the Bahamas, for those of you who don't know that. So this is part of how I ended up interested in these stories. And in 2000, this is around when everybody said, how come we can't tax multinationals? Right? What's going on? What's the story here? And the OECD had been charged with global tax for a couple of decades, and they're like, well, I guess is it us? No, it's not us. It's these gangsters. There's a story in the New York Times where an OECD spokesman calls this list of, a few score black and brown countries gangsters, and accuses them of breaking everything for everybody, which is insane. I always say that if you think the Bahamas destroyed your global tax system, you have a terrible global tax system, right? It's an insane thing, but it's just so easy for people to believe that, oh, well, that's what happened, That's why we can't tax multinationals. It's these, tiny countries that can't do anything, yet they manage to, completely, unman the global north. I mean, it kind of would be good if that were true. It would be kind of inspirational, right? Sort of a Robin Hood kind of thing, but that's not what happened at all. So I'm grateful for all three of you for spending time engaging with the book from your very different perspectives and for being here today. I'm really, really grateful.
I just want to finish that thought. I was looking at that part of the book. So it says so when the OECD spokesman called a group of black and brown countries gangsters in the New York Times and demanded that they be sanctioned to safeguard its members' privileged status, outspoken critics emerged within the United States. Unrepentant, 20 years later, the OECD published its brochure. And then a group of non-member countries, they found themselves cast as villains and threatened with economic sanctions, a ban on banking transactions, and cutoff of development aid. And you say, thanks to global Jim Crow, differences could be portrayed as deviance, which is what you're talking about, right? So different countries trying to get a leg up in the economic system then get cast as deviant because they're taking the economic benefits from Switzerland, from Ireland, from the global north. So that's the available stories of gangsters being hidden in a story of complex tax transactions. I think the law students in this room understand the power of available stories, like what narratives can you tell? What are the stories that are available that a court will be persuaded by? What are the stories that are maybe off the wall arguments that don't come into the center, aren't persuasive? One of the things we're talking about here is what are the persuasive arguments for what are the not persuasive arguments. And Professor Dean is bringing new arguments into the case for global tax equity, actually, is what he's doing. So I have questions based on your comments, and I think we have a little bit of time. So there's a lot of, I had questions because I don't know enough about what's going on, and I'm just assuming that there are people in the room who also feel the same way as I do. And so one of the first things Professor Waris, you mentioned is called the black tax. You were talking about the black. So could you explain a little bit more about what you mean by that when you were in your comments?
So in many parts of Africa, when you have to still pay your income tax or you still have to pay your VAT, but you don't actually get healthcare or education services in return, it's that sort of trade-off. So we call it black tax because when your cousin needs to go to school, you have to pay for tuition. When somebody gets sick, you're paying for their healthcare. And so for me, the book was such a reflection of that because you could see that there were layers of services that different colors of people could access based on race. And that for me came out through Steve's stories about his family life. And because I always focus on the fact that if we're paying taxes, we should be paying them for a purpose. I mean, no taxation without representation, the Boston Tea Party. This is your city, not mine, like I went to see it yesterday. So, but it was something that really it resonated with me. Mm-hmm. And we call it black tax because it's a presumption that as you move around as a person in Africa, a black person, that this is something that's inevitable because the tax system is not there to cover any kind of social services.
Professor Mitchell, so I was very taken by the stories, as were you. I also am a humanities person, and the story of Reconstruction that you mentioned that parallels some of them. I mean, this is a different time. Those are different time periods. Reconstruction 1870s, 1880s versus the 1960s. Can you say something more about the parallels of those stories? Just be more explicit about, because everyone here, I assume, will have or has taken constitutional law, and the stories of Reconstruction come back over and over in our stories of law. They never go away. Yeah.
Well, for my money, what the book does so well is basically make the argument that the way that you were able to exclude Black people from citizenship in the United States is exactly what happens on the global stage But part of what was so powerful is the way that you broke down the 3 lessons from Reconstruction. And one of those lessons was about how the story gets told to say that Reconstruction failed because we shouldn't have tried to give Black people citizenship rights anyway. That was a ridiculous thing to try to do. And of course, you failed at doing that, the Dunning School of Reconstruction. And so making clear to us as readers why that retelling of Reconstruction as a failure on the part of people who were working towards something like goodness and decency, that retelling is still kicking us in the behind, and we need to pay attention to that. I think that's what the book does so well. But I think the other thing that you make me want to bring up about why I'm so like inspired by this way of making some things explicit is that the book also does a really good job of reminding us that the generosity that the African nations are not getting is generosity that was given to European nations. And that is what I mean about being explicit and changing what is most commonly said and done. It's not just about thinking about the disadvantage of marginalized groups. It's about what unearned advantage do you get that isn't questioned if you are that European nation. So that's another way I think that story of Reconstruction is really powerful for thinking about how we need to mobilize now in this moment. I mean, I've been saying for decades that my fellow Americans want me to not just study the 1890s through the 1930s, they want me to feel the violence of that moment, and they're delivering right now. And so to take seriously the parallel that you offer us is really a call to action for all of us, because we are living in that moment where rewriting is happening right now. So again, the book does it beautifully.
Thank
Can I just,
Yeah.
so later today I teach international tax, appropriately enough, and I'll actually be teaching about the foreign tax credit. And so I'll just tiny little bit, not what I'll tell my students later. So at the very end of World War I, the US created the foreign tax credit, so right before the end. And what the foreign tax credit does is it allows somebody who is engaged in a cross-border activity, if they earn income in Germany but they're American, they pay a German tax, they're able to credit their German tax to reduce their US tax. And this was criticized by contemporaries as a generous gift to other countries, again, including Germany. It was a way of subsidizing cross-border commerce, subsidizing foreign governments when there really wasn't the appetite for doing it in a direct way or any other way. It's just so boring that you could do this in tax. You instantly say foreign tax credit, I could see your eyes glaze over a little bit when I said foreign tax credit. But that's the power of it, right? So this is something that you guys have never heard of. That was a really powerful way to help reconstruct Europe, not once, but twice. That gave way at the time of decolonization of Africa.
Dean Taylor, I wanted to ask you, and it's inspired in part by something that Professor Dean said, which is about opportunities in Africa. So you gave us, statistics and explanations of the state of parts of Africa, and but there are in this book, and I think glimmers of hope of where there's real progress being made on the continent of Africa. And I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about that and maybe an explanation for that.
Oh, well, I mean, I'm an Afro-optimist, so I see more than glimmers of hope around the continent. I was citing those statistics because that's what people are familiar with, and when you think about, and they're real and, seriously difficult constraints under which the continent as a whole operates. The danger of talking about Africa, of course, is that we homogenize 55 countries into one big undifferentiated mass, and that gets a little clumsy. And so I apologize if I was
Giving you the opportunity.
My research is on private sector development, so it's an interesting intersection with Professor Dean's. And I see, the emergence of promising investment and advancement and the potential for employment, job creation, reinvestment of surplus, otherwise capitalism in a number of countries in Ghana, in Kenya, in Senegal. Kenya, for example, is the East African hub for investment, the tech sector. It's a troubled but democratic state. There's a tremendous amount of entrepreneurialism in the culture and investment, and so you see Kenya transformed. I even look at still very poor countries like Zambia, where I first visited Zambia in the early 1990s, and it was like what I imagined going shopping in the Soviet Union was like. Long lines for nothing in stores, right? You stand on long lines and the last loaf of bread is gone. And today there's a thriving middle class in Lusaka and in its environs. That's come at some cost, to be sure, right? And it's not all, and it doesn't mean that you have also a thriving healthcare system. The demise of USAID, for example, has devastated the Zambian healthcare system, for example. But there are stories of of private sector success, middle class emergence, of democratization all across the continent. So it's not all bleak, and the overgeneralization is a real peril. So especially for those of us who are political scientists who are charged with teaching about Africa, we don't have the luxury often of saying I'm going to teach a course just on South Africa or just on Nigeria. We're told to teach a course on Africa,
Right.
and so that we have to figure out what that means. Right?
Good. I'm glad to give you an opportunity to say that. Professor Waris, you had, Steve mentioned a new framework that you're working on, a positive tax framework. I wondered if you could say something about that following the comments from Dean Taylor.
So I should point out I'm working on a lot of stuff.
Okay.
And I'm not sure which one Steve is referring to, but I'm going to take a stab at it, which is fine. So for the past now maybe 15, 20 years, I have been working consistently on issues around the creation of an international fiscal authority or a framework. So basically the argument is even bigger than tax. It is to have a global institution that not only works on tax issues and has the debates and the negotiations and the treaties within it, but it also then takes it away from the World Bank and the IMF, for example. It takes it away from the OECD. It's a space where we should also have debt agreements. We should have data repositories where we can look at, because some of the biggest research discoveries we're now making is because the data is now accessible, something that really wasn't as well in the past. But I think the one thing which is probably the hottest on the table right now is that there is a global tax treaty being negotiated. And over the past 10 years, it has been in different levels of debate. It got stuck at the financing for development negotiations in Addis 10 years ago, but has now since then been unlocked. And we were at a stage a year ago when they weren't even making any reference to human beings or human rights or well-being. And so very luckily, we managed to push the negotiations, and it's now it's on the table. Now, I don't know what it means, because you now have 200 countries who are going to now negotiate. And we are in the background with some of the other legal specialists to help with the textual analysis for the Africa group and for some of the others. But at the end of the day, it will rest on political appetite for risk and political appetite for change, but it just means we're just not going to move until it starts moving in a more positive direction. And one thing to add in the Africa discussions for the Dean is that there's going to be a negotiation, and it starts in Nairobi next week. So something new to add to your classroom discussions on what's happening in Africa. So there is a lot happening, and I think we can take a lot of heart from it. Okay. And I think tax is probably one of the few positive spaces in the world right now. So,
Wow.
Yeah. Not usually what we're known for.
All right, so we have 15 minutes, and I would love to open it up to the audience for questions. Questions to Steve, to our panelists.
And I always tell my students, I know people have to leave and do things, so if you want to express displeasure, throw something soft at me. Otherwise, just go quietly, it's fine.
Students have class and people teach after 2. So questions from the audience.
Thank you. Just so interesting. So first of all, I just have to say that Steve Dean is such a gift to BU and to legal profession. And just, yeah, I'm just, so thrilled that he's here. And I just have to say that part of what makes Steve, I mean, many things make Steve a gift, but part of it is we joke a lot about tax. There's a lot of jokes in our faculty about Steve and tax, but the truth is that basically there's this small number of people who understand tax, and then almost everybody else doesn't understand it at all. And that in the story you tell here, that this comes to like why it's such a gift to have Steve here. Almost nobody tells a story about race and tax. There are a few people who do, but I mean, 90% of the law schools, 95% of the law schools in the United States, there's no one telling this story. And I don't think we could say that in most of our fields. I mean, I am in family law, people in con law, the story is told, but it's not told in tax. And so I just kind of want to talk about the way that feature of tax that so few of us understand it, affects its ability to do the work that you're describing here, and kind of in that sense give you an opportunity to make a plug for expanding the number of people who understand what's going on with tax. I know in my little area in the family law space, we always say every social policy problem eventually becomes a tax problem, but it's in a completely different space than this is. And so I just wanted to give you an opportunity to explain why more of us need to understand tax.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's so funny because, again, this is not the book that I plan to write, and I never really planned to be outspoken on race and tax. It's fairly new for me in my career, and there have been a few instances that have made me realize that, I guess I assumed 10 years ago, I would assume that there was much more consensus in the tax space on these questions than there was. But I remember talking to one of my colleagues about the textbook that he wrote, one of the co-authors of, that I had used for years. And there was a case that had been used for, in many case books, including that one, where nobody mentioned that the guy whose tax treatment was terrible, and nobody could really understand. It's in the case book because it comes out the wrong way. And the case doesn't mention that he's black, and the case book doesn't mention either. And so I was talking to this guy, we're having lunch, we're friends, and I say, you may not know that this guy is black, and you should maybe include that in the case book, because this is the way to convey this knowledge to law schools across the country. I thought I was giving him sort of a gift that he could take to his call. I wasn't going to do it out in public. And he thinks about it for a second. He's like, no, I'm not going to do that. And so the happy ending is that one of the 4 old white guy co-authors soon died. I didn't do it. And they brought in a junior woman who had heard me. After that happened, I got outspoken and I wrote about this and I testified in Congress about this. And one of the first things she did becoming a co-author was reach out to me and say, oh, I want to fix this in the casebook. So I thought my mission in life was to, talk to these guys behind the scenes and get them to do things. Apparently that doesn't always work, but by telling stories in Congress, at the UN, and in this book, you can offer that to people, and they can use that in whatever they want to. It's a mixed bag, but certainly, as Dr. Mitchell says, telling stories, making them available, as Dr. Slobey says, it's really something you can do, something you share, and that people out there can realize that maybe tax is boring and important, or maybe even not boring.
So I want to echo everything that Professor Silba said about you as a gift, and thank you all for being here with us.
We don't tax gifts. Just
so the history here is so fascinating, and it's such a valuable contribution for you to unearth it and tell the story. I'm interested in both kind of the UN, what's going on at the UN, and more generally, thinking about the way forward. So if we assumed people of goodwill and a desire to fix things, how would we go about doing that? And you've talked a little bit about sort of structurally, what kinds of structures might help, but what about the substance? What would we do to kind of reverse all of the effects of this inequity over time and to kind of restore us to a desirable place?
Do you want to take a first stab, or?
No, go for it.
So, one of the best things we could do is nothing. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So over the past 5 years or so, there's been a push to create what are called digital services taxes. So these are taxes on our digital giants. And France was one of the first to do this, and the US didn't like it at all. And our current president really didn't like it. And so there's been a lot of pushback on this. The OECD created a whole architecture around pushing back on this, trying to ban digital services taxes. But I'm not sure that it wouldn't be okay to tax our global digital giants, even if there was some risk there would be some inconsistencies across jurisdictions to do this. So we could just not, as the OECD attempted to do, prohibit countries from employing these new kinds of taxes. There are other better versions of this. But again, we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. If these taxes are ways of generating revenue from these global digital giants, it might be worth trying.
Well, I don't think that the battle is over yet as regards keeping conversations around taxation at the United Nations. One of the biggest debates from your country, as well as other members of the G30, for example, is that it's a duplication of the OECD efforts, which is, discussed in the book. And it's quite strange because it meant that 140 countries not being part of something equals duplication if 30 get to do it again, right? So it's a very topsy-turvy argument. But it is an argument that is gaining a lot of traction. And so even though we're having the conversation about a tax treaty at the UN spaces, we still have to make sure member states have support, that there are specialists in the room with them, because honestly, in many cases, there are governments that have no clue why they're there. We've had a series of cases. If you look at who the tax negotiators are, for example, sometimes they're just tax auditors who've just come out of their revenue authorities, thrown into New York or Geneva, not clear what is happening, but they're no longer hitting their targets for all of 2 weeks, and then back into the office again, right? And so there's a desperate need to have access to specialists, global knowledge for all of these negotiators to also understand what they're losing out on. And I think that's really where the biggest challenge is. You cannot see a financial transaction beyond its first transaction right now globally, as much as we live in a digitized world, which means that if I do a second transaction to hide my money, you will have no clue. We're still living in that world, right? So we can see the first one, but never the second one. So if you cannot even see the second one, you cannot see anything. And so we need there to be very clear push. And people call me an activist professor, sorry. But I'm all for human beings standing up and asking and demanding their governments to actually have a system that makes sense for everybody, not just for our selfish selves. Right? And I think that, for me, it's about kindness, it's about not being selfish, and just making sure that we're spreading the finances across the world.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up, because that was one of your question was one I had at the end of the book, and that is, so I wondered, how would the digital services tax sort of compensate for this history?
Oh, not at all.
And especially in Africa, given the nature of investment and the kinds of corporate footprint in Africa.
So I am often accused of being glib, and it is a fair criticism. And it's striking to me that the history that I'm recounting of, and you talked about quite eloquently, of sovereignty curtailed at a critical moment, is being repeated now, like actively now, in defense of are global digital giants. I just can't believe these companies need us to defend them. It's, these poor downtrodden global digital giants need us fighting for them. In truth, in the seminar that I teach based on the book last week, we talked about reparations as an option here. And another colleague and I, Alison Christian, Susan McGill, just submitted something to the UN Committee on Experts about getting them to study reparations, which I would love them to do, but I'm not sure they will. But you can only ask, right? Certainly you don't get it if you don't ask. So I think stopping doing affirmatively bad things like prohibiting new kinds of taxes is one thing, but you could really think about reparations. You could at least think about it and understand, and again, it's a way of telling a story. If you could calculate all that, again, apologies, subpart F has taken from the global south. I know I'm sorry, but if you understood the damage that has done to the global south and you put a price tag on it, that would tell a story. So even if reparations aren't going to happen, I don't think they will. Understanding the orders of magnitude of payments that would be appropriate, I think would be super interesting and powerful as a story.
We have time for more questions. Yes, Linda. Yeah.
Okay. So this was fantastic, very sobering. So in terms of narratives, I'm familiar with this Cold War civil rights story, which is why did the US finally pass civil rights legislation in the 60s? And supposedly because of the Cold War, they were embarrassed about how it made the US look when they had racism at home and they're trying to preach democracy versus communism abroad. And also just the embarrassment of having African diplomats come to the US and not be able to get served or be in a hotel. So I guess I'm wondering how that narrative about, Cold War civil rights, the US finally embraces civil rights 100 years later than it should have. How does that fit in with this story of kind of actively undermining these new countries, and undermining their economic stability and that, because the Cold War civil rights story, it's a pragmatic story, but it's also a story of progress, even if it was motivated by something very strategic. Thank you.
Can I just say, because it's really a question to you, what I got from the book was the idea that there was a splash of news around what would embarrass, but around the tax law, there wasn't a splash of news.
Yeah, so it was just so darn boring, again, that this was able to happen under our noses, right? So it's definitely, I find the arguments around Cold War civil rights, compelling and interesting. I talk about Kennedy is quoted as having complained, so that there were African diplomats driving from the UN to DC, and they try to get served at like Maryland restaurants, and they can't. And they're like, what the hell's going on here? And Kennedy's response is, why are they driving? They should fly. That's a hell of a road. Like, that's his solution, is like,
Highway 40 in Maryland.
Exactly. Like, what do they do? What do they do? That's a terrible drive. Why do they just fly? So, he understands what's happening. And one of the things that I think happened, so that the UN used to be, so the UN might soon be again involved in global tax policy, and in the late 40s and early 50s, they were in charge of it. They were involved. They were deeply involved. There's a great book by Nikki Teo that tells that story that again was lost, about the UN being involved. And I think what happened was that moving things from the UN to the OECD was helpful in that it would avoid, it was not quite having them fly to avoid Highway 40, but if you just had tax happening in an all-white space, which the OECD was at that time, you just wouldn't have those problems. So, Kennedy the solution wasn't to get the African diplomats fed at Maryland restaurants. The solution was to have them fly. And I think what happened with tax was a different sort of solution. How can we avoid any sort of race-based conflicts? Let's make sure it happens in a totally white space, and there'll be no more race-based conflict. So I think that the story, the Cold War civil rights story, is just a very dark one in a lot of ways, in that it took that force civil rights to come to the fore. But there were other ways to solve the problem. Having diplomats fly instead of getting them served at Maryland restaurants one way, and making sure that tax happened in a totally white space where there could be no racial conflicts is another that is consistent with that story.
Okay, I think we're at end. So I just want to, this reminds me of a book. I just finished reading the book Ministry for the Future. Has anyone read that book? It's a sci-fi book by Kim Robinson.
Oh, it's very it's hard sci-fi, man.
It's hard sci-fi. I really hate sci-fi, but I love this book. But it's a way of making concrete the very complicated climate change problems and coordination problems around climate change in the future. And what this panel has made me think about also is how we need a great award-winning novel about global tax policy and racism to elevate the problems, the very complex and very human problems of our global tax policy. And I think we have a great panel of board writers here. So anyway, please put your hands together and thank the panel. And congratulate Steve and Dean. Thank you, Steve.